Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today. I'm Mayor MacArthur, Art and Cultural Director of Japan House Los Angeles. Today, we're delighted to have our special guest, Miko Tsuruga Tucker, from the Ad Museum Tokyo, for our second webinar relating to the current exhibition, Wave, New Currents in Japanese Graphic Arts. Her lecture will explore the relationship between artists and advertising in Japan during the Edo period. But before we meet our guest, I'd like to introduce President of Japan House Los Angeles, Yuko Kaifu, who would like to say a few words of welcome.
Thank you, Mayor. Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar related to the exhibition that we're currently exhibiting, showcasing at Japan House LA, which is entitled Wave, New Currents in Japanese Graphic Arts, which showcases the art of 55 contemporary Japanese artists. Their work is very diverse and they encompass many different realms, including illustrations, comic books, and animation. Many also work in the world of advertising and branding. This is a world where Japanese artists have long been very active ever since 200, 400 years ago in the Edo period. In today's talk, our speaker, Miko Tsuruga Tucker from the Art Museum Tokyo, will look back in time to the Edo period and explore the many ways that Japanese companies back then used art to market their goods and services. And she's going to also talk about how this changed when Japan opened its borders after 200 years of this isolation policy, which is called sakoku. This will be a fascinating look at the relationship between art and advertising dating back to so many years ago. I hope and I'm sure you will enjoy the program. Without further ado, I'd like to hand it back to Mayor, who's going to introduce the speaker. Mayor, back to you.
Thank you, Yuko. Now, first, I'd like to go over some housekeeping, so please turn your attention to the screen. The audience is muted and videos are turned off for this webinar, but the chat is enabled if you'd like to follow it and chat with each other. However, if you'd like to send questions to the speakers, please use the Q&A tool, not the chat, and we will select as many of your questions as we can in the time permits. Now, we're recording this webinar and we will post an edited version of the webinar on our website soon for your friends who aren't able to join us this evening. Now, I am delighted to introduce our speaker for this evening. Miko Tsuruga Tucker has a background in advertising and marketing, and in 2015, she joined the Ad Museum Tokyo, where she works as curator and PR manager. At the Ad Museum Tokyo, she's planned the exhibition's Good Ideas for Good, which introduces visitors to social issues that are unfamiliar in Japan, and to ways that advertising contributes to informing society about those issues. And another exhibition, World Class Creatives Here and Now, which explores new trends in global advertising communication. She's also planned the related events for those exhibitions, and she recently compiled the catalog of the Ad Museum Tokyo collection. Recently, Ms. Tucker has been focused on activities as an educator, and she gives lectures and courses at universities relating to advertising communication, as well as sharing the fun aspects and the social and cultural value of advertising communication to people of all generations. Now, as Yuko said, many of the artists in our current exhibition at Japan House Los Angeles, Wave, work in the world of advertising. So we're very pleased to have Ms. Tucker with us today to present her talk, The Relationship Between Art and Advertising in Edo Period Japan, to give us some insight into the traditional relationship between art and advertising. So welcome, Miko-san. Thank you so much for joining us. She's joining from the Ad Museum Tokyo. Thank you, Miko. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Miko Tsuruga Tucker. Today, I would like to talk about the relationship between art and advertising in Edo period Japan. First, I would like to briefly introduce the Art Museum Tokyo. The Art Museum Tokyo is a museum dedicated to advertising. The museum works to inform as many people as possible to the social and cultural value of advertising communication. In our permanent exhibitions, we introduce the history of advertising in Japan from the Edo period to the present day, and current trends in advertising communication, both in Japan and around the world. are also introduced in our special exhibitions. The museum deals with advertising materials, and the museum even formats such as ukiyo-e, which are typically treated as art forms interpreted from the perspective of advertising. Today, out of all the museum's collections, I would like all of you to join me in looking at some graphic art from the perspective of advertising, with a focus on the Edo period, a time when Japanese culture and the history of advertising can be vividly observed. The Edo period lasted for about 260 years, from 1603 to 1867. Although there were many natural disasters, major fires, and financial difficulties during that time, it is considered a relatively stable, peaceful period of Japanese history. One of the reasons behind this was Japan's national isolationism, one of the country's most well-known places. This is said to have led to stabilizing foreign relations and to developing and maturing the culture of Edo. Until around the 17th century, during the first half of the Edo period, the glamorous cultures catered to samurai, wealthy merchants, and other members of upper classes, primarily in Kyoto and Osaka. Then, in the late 18th century, during the latter half of the Edo period, it developed as the culture of the townspeople of Edo, centering around middle and lower classes, primarily in Edo City. The culture valued the concepts of iki and share, and many works from this time are rich in humor with a touch of irony. It was also during this period that ukiyo-e became a big hit, and kusazoshi illustrated storybooks peaked in popularity. Now, I would like to show you some of the materials in the museum collection, and hidden within these are the origins of modern Japanese pop culture and advertising. The culture of the townspeople of Edo did not flow from the upper classes down to the lower classes. The townspeople themselves were the leaders of the culture. One characteristic of this culture was that things that first became popular among the townspeople were then later accepted by the upper classes. I think it's the opposite of the process in the West. This could be considered a culture that was unique to Japan and unlike anywhere else in the world. It arose and developed as the culture of the common people, and that is likely why its heritage has been passed down to the present day. So what do you imagine that this culture, which was popular among the common people in Edo, was like? Today, I'd like to introduce three things that were especially popular among the residents of the Edo city. The first one is Nishikiri. Have you ever heard of Nishikiri? It's a type of ukiyo-e or woodblock print. Nishikiri refers to a type of ukiyo-e in which woodblocks are used to using multiple colors. The second is Kabuki. I'm sure that many of you have heard the word Kabuki before. It's a type of traditional Japanese theater that has existed since the Edo period. And it has even been designated as UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage. The third is kusazoshi, illustrated storybooks. It is said that the literacy rate among townspeople in Edo was very high, even by global standards. And this enabled entertainment novels to become big hits. What these three have in common is highly sophisticated, multicolored printing techniques, with Nishikiri representing the highest level of artistry. The common people in Edo enjoyed these various forms of prints as entertainment. Merchants realized this and began to make use of art in marketing and advertising. Next, let's take a closer look at some examples how these prints were used in advertising. Nishikiri is now regarded as an art form, but at the time, the term art was only used to refer to traditional paintings by painters employed by the upper classes. Ukiyo-e prints, which are popular among the masses, were exact opposite. Nishikiri were created in collaboration between artists, engravers, and printers under the direction of publishers. The engraving and printing required a degree of precision, time, and effort that would be unimaginable today, and the excellent skills and craftsmanship of the engravers and printers were essential in recreating the images created by artists. Nishikiri is an art form that was both for the people and by the people. They were inexpensive, around $3 at current prices, so common people could easily purchase them for fun or travel souvenirs. As a result, Nishikiri was a very popular form of art among the common people. And although it was enjoyed as a work of art, it was also an information medium comparable to modern-day posters and magazines. Merchants who noticed the popularity of Nishikiri began to use them as advertisements. Nishikiri formed the core of the culture and of popular art. Let's look at some specific examples. The first Nishikiri, painted by Utagawa Kunisada, that I would like to introduce, depicts a kimono store named Mitsui Echigoya. First, let me briefly introduce the store. Mitsui Echigoya is now known as Mitsukoshi department store. This kimono store was founded by a merchant named Mitsui Takatoshi. He used a broad range of marketing techniques, and his methods were so advanced that Peter Drucker wrote in his book Management. Marketing first arose in the 17th century and in Japan, not in the West. Mitsui Takatoshi developed marketing activities that, although commonplace today, were innovative at the time, including cash sales at fixed prices, as well as a number of customer-oriented services, such as same-day tailoring services and free umbrella lending services. This gorgeous set of 3 Nishikiri depicts bustling activity at kimono store Mitsui Echigoya. It is said to have been created as a New Year's handout. It shows 3 beautiful women in front of a store with a prominent sign. Each of them is of different status and is wearing a kimono with a different design. From the way they look, the woman on the right could be a prostitute. The one in the middle is a young wife from a wealthy family, and the one on the left is the wife from a feudal lord. This Nishikiri depicts beautiful women wearing a kimono with new design. In addition to announcing the release of Mitsui Echigoya's newly designed kimono, this Nishikiri also served as a fashion magazine or fashion advertisement. As a large merchant house, Mitsui Echigoya was also one of the most famous places in Edo, and it was depicted in many meishoe, or pictures of famous spots. Later, other rival stores began to release similar Nishikiri one after the other. This one is from a kimono store called Daimaru, also painted by Kunisada, and this one is from Shirokiya, also a kimono store painted by Kunisada. Echigoya, Daimaru, and Shirokiya were the 3 biggest kimono stores in Edo. However, for a time in the Meiji period, even Mitsui Echigoya fell into a serious financial slump. After that, the company studied department stores in the West and transformed into Japan's first ever department store, modeled after Harrods in London, with the goal of selling a broad range of items. Today, it's one of Japan's leading department stores. Next, let's look at some examples of Nishikiri known as bijin-e, pictures of beautiful women. The first one depicts sake. This Nishikiri, painted by Utagawa Kuniyoshi, shows the most popular brand of sake at the time called Kenbishi, which was brewed in Kansai region and shipped to Edo. It's one of a series of Nishikiri in his Enshi 16 Josen series. This is a series of paintings of beautiful women based on famous Chinese hermits here. The caption reads, "In the town of Edo, there's sake like this so delicious that not even hermits know about it." Both Kenbishi sake and the geisha depicted here were objects of desire among the common people. Competing brands also created Nishikiri advertisements depicting beautiful women. This Nishikiri, painted by Keisai Eisen, is from a local sake manufacturer in Edo called Sumidagawa, one of Kenbishi's rivals. It may have been created as a way of competing against Kenbishi. Apparently, it didn't taste as good as Kenbishi, but it was in demand among the common people for its low price. When I saw this, I imagined that they are like the so-called Budweiser girls. Of course, they look completely different, but I see the similarities between them in that they are all poster girls. These Nishikiri also show how competition has fueled the development of advertising through the ages. The next Nishikiri, also painted by Keisai Eisen, features cosmetics. This Virginia, or picture of a beautiful woman, is an advertisement for white facial powder. It was painted by a popular artist and features the name Senjoko, a brand of white facial powder. Since it's a Virginia painted by a famous artist, we can assume it was very effective advertisement. There's a poem written on the Virginia, and it contains the product name. The poem served as the equivalent of modern day advertising copy. The creation of these sorts of nishikiri featuring beautiful women for advertising purposes and created by sake and cosmetic manufacturers is also considered the origin of posters of beautiful women in Japan. Next, let's look at a type of nishikiri called meishoe, pictures of famous spots. This is Tokaido 53 Tsugi, painted by Utagawa Hiroshige. Can you tell where an advertisement has been painted into this nishikiri? It's actually here. You can see the name Senjoko, the brand of white facial powder that also appeared in the Virginia we saw a moment ago. Travel and leisure were also popular during the Edo period. The common people in Edo began to travel through the city or out to the suburbs for fun, and they would casually visit Ise Shrine or go on pleasure trips. These nishikiri depicting famous spots or road scenes satisfied the curiosity of people who had never seen such places, while also serving as the equivalent of modern day travel posters and pamphlets. Even in these pictures of famous spots, you can catch glimpses of advertisements here and there. In this way, nishikiri provided the people of Edo with entertainment in a variety of settings, while at the same time serving as an important source of information. Next, let's look at some examples that make use of Kabuki. Going to see Kabuki was a special delight for the people of Edo. Some people would be so excited even days before the performance that they would go out and get a new kimono for it. The actors in Kabuki were both superstars and trendsetters. The most commonly created nishikiri were of popular Kabuki actors and plays. Let's look at some advertisements that made good use of combining Kabuki with nishikiri. This is nishikiri called Sukeroku Yukari no Edo Zakura, painted by Toyohara Kunichika. This play is set in the Yoshiwara red light district. It tells the story of Sukeroku, a hero to the people of Edo, who is trying to get revenge for his father and takes back a sword that is family heirloom. As the story unfolds, he became involved with Agemaki, the #1 courtesan in Yoshiwara, and the object of Sukeroku's love, as well as with a rival who is also in love with her. This is Sukeroku and this is Agemaki. Throughout the play, actual products such as brands of sake, udon noodles, and sobering up medicine, and so on, appear one after the other. Due in part to the explosive popularity of Ichikawa Danjuro, who played the leading role, the products that appeared in the play became huge hits. Corporate tie-ups and product placements in movies and television dramas are now common, but it is surprising to realize that they were already taking place in Edo period. Corporate tie-ups involving the recent movie 007, No Time to Die, became a major topic of interest. Product placement solidified through super well-known brands from automobiles to clothing used by Daniel Craig playing Bond, including Aston Martin, Triumph, Tom Ford, Omega, and more, have also become big news in Japan. This one is painted by Utagawa Toyokuni. What do you think is happening in this nishikiri? This is actually a picture of Kabuki actors advertising a product. The writing here explains it. It seems that between acts during the play, Kabuki actors would come out and say, I know that we are in the middle of a play, but I have an announcement to make. In order to advertise products, it was exactly like modern day television commercials. The actor is holding a sign for toothpaste, and they are advertising the product through speech. At the end of the advertisement, one of the actors also tells the audience, if you try it and like it, please spread the word. That's the equivalent of modern day social media. We are talking about an age when there was no television or internet. The effects of commercial featuring popular talents must have been tremendous. This is a paper fan painting of a popular Kabuki actor painted by Utagawa Kunisada. You can see the white facial powder brand Senjoko that we saw earlier partially hidden behind the paper fan. At the time, there was also a campaign in which people who brought 10 wrappers of Senjoko would receive a paper fan signed by popular Kabuki actor. You may remember that Senjoko also appeared in the section on Nishikiri. The brand Senjoko seems to have made full use of all types of media in its advertising activities. There's another thing I want to point out. While Senjoko made use of various print media as advertisements, it was always depicted in a low-profit manner, as you can see in these paintings, making sure it was never overly conspicuous. Don't be too obtrusive in advertisements. Seems to have been the sense of aesthetic value held by the people of Edo. These are just a few examples of advertisements that make use of Kabuki and pictures of Kabuki actors. You can see it is truly amazing that advertising featuring talents was already being used strategically in the Edo period. These pictures of actors and plays were painted by artists who were popular at the time. Popular artists painting star actors helped these products become big hits. And people admire and imitated the hairstyles, cosmetics, and clothing that appeared in these sorts of nishikiri, which gave them media value beyond that of mere publicity pictures. Next, I would like to introduce kusazoshi. Do you know any Japanese manga? Manga is one of the most popular aspects of Japan's pop culture, and its roots can actually be seen as far back as Edo. First, let me briefly introduce kusazoshi. Kusazoshi are books for the common people, and they are classified into several different types, including red-covered, blue-covered, and yellow-covered storybooks. Among these, the yellow-covered storybooks, a type of illustrated entertainment novels for adults, known in Japanese as kibyoshi, were particularly popular. Many of these are lightly satirical and based on the daily lives of common people. They were a big hit among the residents of the town. Originally, books were only used in education, such as medical and Buddhist texts. But the townspeople of Edo also enjoyed them in this way for fun. Even world-famous artists such as Katsushika Hokusai and Kitagawa Utamaro worked on illustrations for these yellow-covered storybooks. Writers such as Santo Kyoden, Shikitei Samba, and others, as well as publishers, including Tsutaya, took advantage of kibyoshi, a popular entertainment form, to turn it into an advertising medium. The first kibyoshi I will introduce is Haranouchi Nozoki Karakuri. It's a story that might remind you of a film called Fantastic Voyage. There was once a famous doctor, Chikuan. A messenger from the gods appeared before him and gave him a magic pillow that he could help him cure otherwise incurable diseases. Using this magic pillow, he was able to shrink to microscopic size and enter his patients' bodies. Once inside, he would identify the cause and fight the illness using an army comprised of medicine. The name of the medicine comes out naturally in the story as it draws the reader in. I think it's an excellent mid-story tie-up advertisement. There was also advertisement at the end of the book for signboards and books about medicine. Here is another one, This kiboshi was given away free of charge with purchase of a brand skin lotion called Edo no Mizu. Edo no Mizu was a brand of skin lotion sold at a store operated by the popular fiction writer Shikitei Samba. Operation of the store was later taken over by his son, Kosamba. Here's a story in this book. A couple adopts an abandoned child and lovingly raises her, but she's so ugly that no one will marry her. However, this child is actually a god who has disguised herself as a human in order to help the couple and Shikitei Kosamba. Later, both the couple's business and Kosamba's store flourish economically. It is written to be first and foremost an interesting story without sounding like an advertisement. And the advertisement was placed on the inner side of the cover. Also, the advertisement itself was designed as a story of a fight between authentic Edo no Mizu and imitation product, which is amazingly clever. So we have looked at examples of advertising that appeared in Nishikiri, Kabuki, and Kusashi, three major forms of entertainment in the Edo period. Incidentally, here is a picture of a store called Ezoshiya, which sold these items. When we zoom in, from the words and pictures have been drawn, we can see that they are selling pictures of Kabuki actors, pictures of famous spots of Edo, and illustrated storybooks. This is a woman conversing in front of a store with a child on her back. In his hand is something that they may have just purchased. He's holding what looks like Nishikiri. So we can imagine people in Edo probably visit such stores to buy Nishikiri and Kusashi as a fun part of their day. These various woodblock prints were created by talented craftsmen, but we know that the presence of the publication producers who worked behind the scene was also significant. The Kabuki actors could be considered the talents, and the fiction writers considered the copywriters. The artists could be considered the designers, and the publishers considered the art directors and producers. And the publishers, a lot must have also depended on the producer's ability to organize all of these people and formulate and enact plans so that each of them could do their best work. The same holds true today, as artists are only able to flourish due to the presence of capable producers. The aesthetic sense of the common people in Edo, woodblock printing techniques, which developed to a high level during the Edo period, and woodblocks and Japanese paper, which were cheaper and could be mass-produced. The combination of these factors led to the establishment of print art in Edo, with Nishikiri at the top. And they made the culture of the townspeople richer and more intellectual. These were some examples of advertisements from the three categories of Nishikiri, Kabuki, and Kusashi that made use of Edo art. These forms of media, which developed in Edo, still exist today, and they could be considered the roots of the Japanese pop culture that we are familiar with today. This was the story of advertising in the Edo period. The Art Museum Tokyo published a book called Edovertising, which goes into more detail. It's available from our website. In the Meiji period, as the Edo shogunate finally ended its rule and the new government was formed, the policy of national isolationism was lifted, bringing dramatic changes in politics and systems. Under the new government, the process of Westernization introduced aspects of Western culture into Japan en masse. This had a major impact on media, graphic design, and other areas. With the introduction of lithographic printing technologies from overseas, the first posters in Japan were created in the Meiji period. The woodblock printing techniques used to create Nishikiri quickly merged with lithographic technology and developed into large format posters. New media, such as newspapers and magazines, also appeared in Japan during the Meiji period. It was during the Meiji period that the word kokoku, meaning advertising, arose in Japan. In addition to posters, graphic designers also began to work on newspaper advertisements and magazine cover designs. Even after Westernization, the Japanese style sensibilities that took root among the common people were passed down through the generations to the present day, while at the same time skillfully incorporating aspects of Western culture. Even Mitsui Echigoya's advertising posters, which I introduced earlier, were greatly influenced by the West, in this way from the Meiji period onward. We are attracted to beautiful things, and we laugh or are moved by things that interest us. In every era of history, advertisements have employed intelligence and ingenuity to move people's hearts, using a broad range of ideas. Advertising has always incorporated art loved by the masses, and I believe that the same holds true today. The Japanese spirit coupled with Western learning. We imitate quality ideas from around the world and arrange them in uniquely Japanese ways. This is not limited to pop culture. This may be a unique aspect of Japanese culture that is shared by all industries, from the automotive industry to the consumer appliance industry. Lastly, art and advertisements exist in the trend of the times. By looking at advertisements, you can learn about the social conditions and the culture of that time. Advertising is a mirror to society. If you have the opportunity to visit Japan, please be sure to stop by the Art Museum Tokyo. Thank you very much for listening today.
Thank you so much, Miko-san. What a fascinating presentation. I've been looking at all the questions and they've been pouring in. People have been really enjoying your presentation. So thank you so much. If you have questions, I'm going to keep checking the Q&A and we'll try to share them with Miko-san now. At this point, I'd like to introduce our translator for today, David Neptune, and he's going to join us to translate some of the audience questions from Miko-san, and he's also going to translate her answers in Japanese back into English. So welcome, David. So I'm going to ask a first question quickly to Miko-san, and I'm going to connect it to a question from an audience member that you talked about Kabuki actors advertising products and services. And you also mentioned a few beautiful women advertising skincare products, but women such as courtesans in the pleasure quarters, did they promote and endorse many products in the Edo period?
ですね、まず広告という概念自体が、江戸にはなかったんですけれども、この中でやはりその錦絵のモデル題材として町の美人だったりとか芸者だったりとか、あと遊女、吉原の遊女が描かれることがたくさんあります。でこの人たちはその広告のモデルになってくださいと言われてモデルになっていたというよりは、この絵師たちが町で評判の美人だったりとか、すごいこう評判の高い花魁だったりとか、そういう町の人たちにとても人気のある女の人を探し出して、でその人をモデルに描いてるっていうことで、このモデルさんに直接モデルになってもらえませんかっていう感じで聞いたんではないというようなことは推察されます。
So in the Edo period, there wasn't really that idea of advertising necessarily, but the beautiful women, and in particular the courtesans and the prostitutes from the Yoshiwara, they weren't directly asked to be models for these advertisements, but the people who wanted to, the artists who would portray these people would basically base the rumors and the people's, the townspeople and how they would be speaking about these women to choose who they would depict in their artwork.
でもう一つあるのが、その絵師とか版元、版元もそうなんですけど、その今でいう広告主ですよね。商品をこれを使って広告しようっていう人たちも含めて、常にこのビジネスをしている人たちっていうのは、この江戸の町で今何が流行っているのか、誰が人気なのかっていうことを常になんか意識しながら各題材を探していたようにも思います。
And also artists and publishers would always sort of keep their ears out for all of the business people really would keep their ears up for who's popular right now, who's most known out there with the common people. And those would be the ones that they would portray in the advertisements.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions from audience members relating to that question. So I'd like to put those to you next. Several people noticed the Utamaro print showing beautiful women making nishikiri. And so I've had some questions about women's role in printing. I did answer one and explain that it was just a fantasy, that a lot of the Utamaro print was creating images of women printing, but they didn't really do the printing. These are just beautiful women playing that role in the print. But one other audience member asked if women had any role in this advertising process at all. In the Edo period, were there women involved with the publisher, with the printer, so what was the role of women? Can you answer that at all?
今、メイヤさんがおっしゃった通りだと思うんですけど、まず最初に私が、出した錦絵を作っている工場みたいなところの絵が全部女性で描かれてたっていうのは、やはり当時、目で見るのは美しいものがいいということで、実際はこれ、摺師とか彫り師っていうのはほとんど男性だったんですけれども、女性で描かれているっていうのはそうだと思います。で、じゃあこの錦絵作りの中で女性がどう関わっていたかっていうのは実はちょっとすいません、あんまり、資料がありませんで、ただですね、例えば葛飾北斎の娘とかは実はその絵師として表には出なかったけれども活躍していたっていうような記録もあったりしますので、もしかするとこの絵師とかの中には実は女性みたいなことが含まれていたりするケースはあるかもしれないですね。ただ、摺師彫り師はほぼ男性だったというふうに聞いております。特にその摺師っていうのはすごい力が必要な作業だったっていうこともあるので、女性の活躍というのはすいません、ちょっとあまり聞いたことがないです。
So, Mayor, it's exactly like you were saying. Nishikiri that you were mentioning and answered the question about is indeed kind of more of a fantasy. And at the factory, it was usually men who were the ones that were doing both the carving of the wood blocks and the printing. And we don't have any information about women's involvement in advertising sort of behind the scenes in the business side of things. But there is an example of, for example, Hokusai. His daughter was an acclaimed artist and she didn't really go out into the public very much, or she didn't have like a reputation out in the industry necessarily, but she did have a lot of notable works. And so we could assume that there were many others as well. But most of the people who were actually printing especially was something that required a lot of strength, a lot of muscle. And so that was something that was usually done by the men.
So I have several questions from audience members about the target audience for these nishikiri. A lot of the questions are about nishikiri, and that's a really popular subject. So one question is generally, who were the target audience members? Who were these prints made for? And part two of that question is, were these prints very beautiful and elaborate so that they could reach people who couldn't read? So they would bridge the literacy gap. So I know the population of Edo was very literate, but maybe some people couldn't read. So these images were a very strong way to convey a message. And part three of that is related. Where would these prints go? Were they posted? They were ads, so were they posted or were they sold? I'm adding that last part to the question, were they sold? Because I think the publishers were very clever. I think they were selling these prints as well as being paid to advertise at the same time. So I think they were getting double money.
でまず1つ目の質問なんですけれども、広告のターゲットは誰ということなんですが、特に今みたいに広告が戦略的に行われていたんですけれども、今みたいに広告専門の業界があったわけではないので、各広告主、お店の人たちがですね、この人気のある錦絵を使えば、商品が売れるんじゃないかということで広告を載せたっていうこともあるんですが、一つですね、江戸の時代に特徴的だったのが、最初にもちょっと英語だと説明難しいんですけれども、説明した江戸の粋とかシャレっていう文化がすごく関係していると思うんですね。で、ターゲット自体については多分一般大衆全般に向けてということだと思うんですけれども、実は 今のように、じゃあお金をいくら払うから広告を載せてくださいっていうことよりも、例えば千手香、おしろいがあったと思うんですけど、千手香とかだと、その版元がですね、千手香を売ってるお店の人との関係性だったりっていうことを持ちつ持たれつ、お互いに世話をするみたいな感じで、今回は版元が、気を利かせて君のところのおしろいを入れる。で次、じゃあ千手香を売っていた坂本屋というところなんですけれどもはですね、実はその町の権力者でもあったんですね。でその権力者に次回何かあった時には計らいをしてもらうっていうことで、例えば千手香とかだとお金を払ってなくても、版元が気を利かせて広告を載せたっていうこともあったりします。ちょっと長いので一個一個いきます。まずここで切ります。
So I'll answer the first question first. The ads target was not something that was as strategic. It wasn't like there's a whole industry like there is now for ads. So what would happen is owners of companies would just use the most popular Nishikie of the time and have their company name sort of inserted into them. And so as I shared in the beginning of the presentation, the idea of iki and share are very important as well as sort of aspects that made things popular then. So all of the public was really the target for these ads, but there was never really money exchanged. Like companies didn't pay the artists to insert their ads into the Nishikie. It was just sort of a, you scratch my back, I scratch yours sort of relationship where they would help each other out and they would say, okay, this time I'll include the ad for you in this Nishikie. So next time, Mr. Sakamoto, for instance, was a very powerful politician at the time who was also the owner of the Senjoko that we saw. And so there would be some sort of arrangement where they would help them out if something came up in the future and they needed someone to sort of help them out in some way. That was more the arrangement then.
一つ目のちょっとすいません、続きなんですけれども、ただ、結果として例えばこの、プレゼンの中で紹介しました内輪絵、役者が描かれた下に千手香のパッケージがあったと思うんですけれども、10個集めると内輪がもらえるっていうキャンペーンを紹介したと思うんですけれども、結果としてそういうものを出した時にはもちろんおしろいが女性用っていうこともあるので、それはもう女性を意識しているものだと思うんですけれども、若い子たちも自分では10個買えるお金がないのでお父さんにねだってどうしても内輪が欲しいから10個買ってよっていうようなことを言っていたっていうような、川柳も残っていたりします。
As a continuation to answer the same question, the uchiwa-e that we saw in the presentation where we had the actors portrayed on a fan with an ad on it, if they were able to buy 10 of these such uchiwa-e, then they were basically given a special fan. And so it was mainly for women, but also younger women, young kids would ask their parents if they didn't have enough money to buy all 10 so that they could get this special one. And so that was also one of the strategies.
で、2つ目の質問です。文字が読めない人たちのために、錦というのは鮮やかになったのかということなんですけれども、文字が読めない人がいるので鮮やかになったというよりは、やはりその元々の、浮世絵から錦絵に発展していくにかけて、やはりその職人たちが少しでも大衆に人気のあるものを、もっと美しいものをっていうことで切磋琢磨していった結果だと思います。で、識字率については、諸説あるんですけれども、武士たちはほぼ 100% の識字率で、町人たちに関しては、これも年代によっても説はあるんですが 50% から 60% 合わせると、平均すると7割8割ぐらいの人が文字が読めたんじゃないかというふうに実は言われています。
Rather than sort of being this is the question about the literacy rate being an effect of making these Nishikie really beautiful, rather than that being the reason, it was more because the natural evolution of going from ukiyo-e to Nishikie and the sort of skill of the craftsman was really focused on how do we make it more and more beautiful. And so it naturally evolved in that way. The literacy rate was in the warrior class it was basically known as 100%. And then for the general townspeople, for your middle class, it was 60%. So the average was about 70 to 80% of literacy rate at the time.
3つ目の質問です。で、どこに貼っていたかとか、売っていたものなのかっていうことなんですけども、実はですね、広告用に広告を専門として作ったっていう錦絵はほとんどないので、引き札っていうものだったらあるんですけれども、錦絵はやはりどちらかというと庶民が楽しむためのものなので、これはお店で売っていたものです、ほとんどが。で、先ほど紹介した例えば三井越後屋の新年に配っていた挨拶ニューデザインのもの、新しいデザインのものっていうのは、無料で配ってた可能性はあるんですけれども、他の錦絵っていうのはお店で売られていたものもたくさんあります。お店で売られていたものにも広告は入っていたりしました。で、それを、江戸の町人たちは買って、300円、400円ぐらいなので楽しみで買って、家で例えばこう眺めてみたりとか、ある人は家の壁に貼っていたりとか、楽しみ方は人それぞれだったとは思います。
So on the question of whether these Nishikiri were posted or whether they were purchased and decorated in homes and so forth, almost none of these Nishikiri were specifically made as advertisements, and they were for the everyday townspeople. And so they were all basically sold. But for instance, the Mitsui New Year's design, like the postcard that they had there, that may have been a free handout that they gave out to people as a special thing for New Year's. But a vast majority were bought, and they were sold for about 300 to 400 yen on average. So that's $3 or $4 on today's standards. But they would basically either take them home and just have them to look at any time, or some people would put them on the wall. So everybody enjoyed them in different ways.
Thank you. I'm sorry, that was such a long question in 3 parts. There are a lot of questions. I think we have a lot of people in the advertising and marketing business asking questions. One question that I've received from a few people is are there any statistics or any information about whether these advertising techniques were successful? For example, to sell the white powder, did it help the business to have their name in these prints?
はい、いただきました質問ですが、広告の効果測定に関してはですね、例えば三井越後屋、着物の呉服店ですね、三井越後屋は自身で効果測定を行っていたという記録も残っています。ただし、それが具体的な数字がどうだったのかっていうのは、すいません、ちょっとそこは今、わからないんですね。特に、今回錦絵をご紹介しましたけれども、効果測定が盛んに行われたのは引き札と呼ばれる今でいうフライヤーですね。引き札に関しては効果測定をきちんと行っていたっていう記録も残っています。ただ錦絵に関してはどの程度効果測定が行われたのかというのはあまりすいません、ちょっと記録にもあんまり見られてないんですね。先ほどの質問の答えでもお答えしましたように、その川柳にも読まれるほど、例えばさっきのおしろいの内輪の話もそうですけれども、それを載せたらやっぱりそのスーパースターのやってる広告っていうことですごい効果があったっていうのは、その当時の文献としてはあまり残ってないんですけれども、川柳だったりとかそういった人々の会話、もしくは草草子だったりとか、そういうお話の中では一部垣間見ることはできます。
There is evidence that the effectiveness of these ads was being monitored and records were being kept. Unfortunately, we don't have the actual numbers of any of this, but we know for sure that Mitsui, for instance, monitored these things over the years. And with the Nishikiri, we don't really have any information, but I guess not a lot of information for either. But we do know that with hikifuda, which are like modern day flyers, those were especially monitored in terms of how they affected or the effectiveness of them. What we can say is that most people would pay attention to these ads because, with the superstars on them, and people like Sendyu as well would look at these things or be involved. And especially with the kusazoshi, the illustrated comic books, people were very aware of what was in those.
Well, thank you so much. There were several more questions, but I'm afraid we've run out of time and it's time for us to wrap up. On behalf of everyone attending the webinar, I'd just like to thank you, Miko-san, for a really wonderful presentation. I'd also like to thank the Ad Museum Tokyo for collaborating with us on this program and making it possible to have Miko-san talk today. And I can't wait to visit the museum next time I'm in Tokyo. And thank you all for your great questions. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to them all, but I hope that you're satisfied with the various answers that we did get. Now, I'd like to invite everyone that we have more webinars coming up, including one on Thursday, November 18th about Japan's national parks, which will be a wonderful introduction to these parks that are relatively unknown outside Japan. And we will also have our final program for the Wave exhibition, and we're holding that on site, which we're very excited about. We'll have a DJ in the gallery playing City Pop on Saturday, November 13th from 1 till 3 p.m. And you can stay up to date on all of our events by subscribing to the Japan House LA newsletter. And today, when you exit the program, please take a little time to fill out our survey so that we can continue to provide content that's relevant to your interests. Thank you again for joining us today, and a huge thank you to Miko Tsuruga Tucker from the Ad Museum Tokyo for her fascinating talk. Enjoy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of your day, and thank you so much for joining us today. And now you can open your museum and let your visitors in. Thank you so much. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Stay safe.